Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Asking About Gender, Confronting Assumptions and Challenging Transphobia. This webinar is a co-presentation by LGBT YouthLine and YouthREX, or Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange. We're really glad that so many of you could join us today. We want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available within the next week or two on YouthREX's website for you to review. And we will also be sharing the slide deck from today's presentation in an email that you will receive after the session. You will notice that you can access a live transcription of this session in English, which you can also see through the closed caption function on the platform. We are going to begin today with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that we are coming together in a virtual space and that we may be physically located on different lands. And the land acknowledgement is really a recognition, one that is meant to honor the Indigenous peoples of these lands historically and presently, to call out colonization and white supremacy historically and presently, and to express gratitude and appreciation for our individual and collective relationships with the lands on which we live and work. And we encourage you all to take a moment to reflect on how you came to be on the lands on which you live and work. Our relationship to land is tied to our individual and collective histories and identities. Personally, I am both a fourth-generation settler of English descent and the granddaughter of Yugoslavian immigrants. I'm located in Toronto, the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations and covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. If you would like to share your land acknowledgement in the chat box, we encourage you to do so. YouthREX's provincial office is located at York University. Both YouthREX and York University acknowledge their presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So my name is Katie Rogers, and I am the Knowledge Exchange Director at YouthREX, Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange. And YouthREX partnered with LGBT YouthLine to develop a resource, a toolkit for youth workers called Asking About Gender. And this is a toolkit that we released a few weeks ago. The resource is a practical tool, but it is also intended to initiate conversations like the one we'll be having today. In this webinar, we will explore the concept of gender. We will unpack assumptions about gender as they are presented in the Asking About Gender toolkit, and we will discuss transphobia, what it is, how it manifests, and how we can seek to challenge it. We will set aside time towards the end of the webinar for your questions, but we encourage you to share these questions throughout the session using the chat box. We appreciate and welcome all comments and questions that are shared in the spirit of honest inquiry, good faith, partnership, and respect. So thank you all for being here today. And now I am going to ask my colleague Khadija to introduce herself and to share a little bit about the work that she does and that we do at YouthREX.
Good afternoon, people in the computer. Thank you, Katie, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for joining us. As Katie said, my name is Khadija Kanji. I'm a Youth Prem Support Associate here at YouthREX. And I know, and I've seen from the chat, that we're all joining from a wide geography. I'm here in Mississaugas of the Credit Treaty Territory, colonially known as Markham, where it makes perfect sense for me to be wearing a turtleneck a week before we enter the month of May. So a little bit about YouthREX. Our vision at YouthREX is in Ontario, where shared knowledge is transformed into positive impact for all youth. And we aspire towards this through our mission, which is to make research evidence and evaluation accessible and relevant to Ontario's youth sector through knowledge exchange, capacity building, and evaluation leadership. Katie?
Knowledge exchange includes opportunities like we have today, where we come together, stakeholders from across the youth sector, to share knowledge, to gain new insights, and to expand our understandings. It also includes the curation and creation of resources that connect shared knowledge to youth work practice, and our Knowledge Hub has over 1,800 resources that do this on YouthREX's website, so we encourage you to check that out. We also provide capacity building opportunities, as Khadija mentioned. This is through our YouthREX Ed programming. Our online platform, Learn by YouthREX, features online certificates and workshops where you can come together to learn new skills, build your capacity, and connect with your peers across the youth sector. And our research and evaluation work comprises community engaged research projects, evaluations of youth programs using YouthREX's 7-phase evaluation framework. And we also provide customized supports to youth programs that need a little guidance or a little extra capacity around the design, development, and evaluation of your program. So if we can be of support to you, all of our services and supports are free. We encourage you to get in touch with us. And now I'm going to invite Saadia to share a little bit about their work and the work of LGBT YouthLine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Saadia. My pronouns are they and them. I'm a trans, non-binary youth joining you today from Mississauga, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. I am the communications specialist at LGBT YouthLine. And we are a 2S LGBTQ+ youth-led organization that affirms and supports youth across Ontario. Our vision is to see youth of all sexual and gender identities be celebrated and supported. And to do this, we, one, provide anonymous peer support and referrals through our peer support helpline. Two, train youth to provide support to other youth. And three, provide resources so that youth can make informed decisions.
Okay, so why are we here? At YouthREX, something that we encounter frequently in our evaluation work with youth programs are demographic surveys. And these are data collection tools that a program will use in order to know who they are serving and whether they are reaching the right people. And so these demographic surveys will often ask a variety of questions of interest. How old are you? Where do you live? What is your gender? What is your sexual orientation, etc. And many of you would be familiar with these surveys yourself, either as an administrator or as a respondent. And what we've realized through our repeated interaction with these demographic surveys is that they become a site for a common paradox within the social services sector. The paradox being that those people most in need of our programming are also generally those who are least likely to receive appropriate care within them. To explain this, let's just take a step back. So I think a lot of us can recognize that our youth programs, whether they're a transitional housing space, a mental wellness program, a drop-in center, a subsidized sports league, most of our youth programs exist because of an unfulfilled need. And we also know that in the context of systemic oppression, this need is distributed unevenly. And that in particular, those who are marginalized by virtue of race or class or gender, ability, sexual orientation, and other human-made systems, those who are marginalized through these human-made systems are disproportionately burdened by unmet need. In other words, systemic oppression organizes our access and our opportunity so that those who are non-white, those who are poor, queer, trans, two-spirit, non-binary, neurodivergent, and or physically divergent are more likely to have unmet need and therefore to be in need of our services. However, systemic oppression doesn't only inform the fact of need or the existence of need. Oppression is so deeply embedded into our systems of logic, our systems of relating to one another, that it also informs how we engage in this work to meet need. In other words, in our very efforts to compensate for systemic oppression and the need that arises out of systemic oppression, in our efforts to compensate for this through our youth programming interventions, we often rely on and reproduce oppressive logics. And one of the ways that oppressive logic shows up in our youth programming efforts is in our demographic surveys. Specifically, the way we ask questions in order to know who our participants are, as we find, often reflect problematic assumptions. And these problematic assumptions implicate us in causing harm, even in our very efforts to help counteract or compensate for harm. And from our work in this area, we've realized that in particular, the demographic question on gender is one of the more overtly and ubiquitously problematic ones.
So as we mentioned before, YouthREX and LGBT YouthLine partnered to develop a toolkit asking about gender, and it does support the youth sector in respectfully and accurately responding to the young people with whom we work and all of their gender diversity. And it does this in two ways. First, it unpacks assumptions that are, as Khadija said, ubiquitous but implicit, that are inherent in demographic questions about gender. And then it also provides an inclusive gender menu that can be used as an alternative. And we'll make sure that we share links to the toolkit and the inclusive gender menu if you have not had an opportunity to see these resources.
So in today's webinar, we'll dissect gender and its common misconceptions. We'll also talk about transphobia as a form of oppression underpinned by problematic gender. And finally, we'll introduce to you the toolkit and an inclusive gender menu that you can use for your demographic surveys.
Okay, and so I know by this point, we've done a lot of talking about what we're going to talk about, but still, before we begin, we wanted to offer some reminders or tips for framing that can inform how we approach this topic, and that will hopefully help us to maximize the benefits that we all gain from this webinar. So some tips for engaging. Let us remember that we are firstly not so much like what is asked of us is not so much to learn about gender diversity, but rather to unlearn our gender rigidity. And that might seem like a sort of semantical point, but it's an important reframing because it forces us to make visible to ourselves our lifelong socialization into problematic and limited gender norms. And this socialization is so thorough and pervasive that we don't often notice it. It's made invisible. And so we assume coming into this that our dominant ways of knowing about gender are common sense or natural or reflective of reality, but in fact, they're not. And the reason why we need to do this work of learning about gender, the reason why we need to gather here today is precisely because we have already spent all of our lives learning about gender, but in a way that is incomplete or limited or problematic. And it's important for us to make our gendered socialization visible so that we can honestly and appropriately engage in the work of interrogating and challenging. So remember, we're unlearning, not learning. Secondly, we shouldn't think of this webinar, the toolkit, or any other important learning we engage in. We shouldn't think of it as representing an endpoint. We've existed in gender norms for our entire lives, and undoing the harms associated with them is similarly a lifelong project that involves both internal self-reflection and external advocacy. We must also remember that our attempts to account for and to respond accurately to our clients in all of their gender and other diversity, our attempts to respond accurately to our clients and appropriately is not a favor we're doing for them. On the contrary, what we're trying to do here is to make available to everyone the respect and care that we're all entitled to and that people who generally conform to normative standards already receive. And so this isn't an act of kindness, it's one of basic justice. And by engaging in this critical self-reflection work, we are also helping ourselves, regardless of how or to what extent we do or do not conform to gender norms or expectations, we are all in fact limited by gender rules, because they impose on all of us unstated but powerful limitations on the way we express ourselves and relate to one another. So unpacking dominant gender opens all of us up to new opportunities and possibilities. And then finally, in discussing this webinar, this was a conversation we had with our friends and co-presenters at YouthLine, they brought up an important point, which is that even though it's important to make our demographic surveys accurate and inclusive, we should also actually be questioning why it's such a norm in our sector to be collecting so much personal data on the people that we're serving. Usually our clients need our services, whether that's therapy or food bank. They need them because they aren't able to access them in the private market. And people who are able to purchase these services privately never have to answer questions about who they are. And so it's a burden that is uniquely placed on those in need to answer detailed questions about who they are, and a burden that doesn't usually help us to serve them better. And something that we realized through this conversation then is that our efforts to make our demographic surveys more accurate and inclusive is important, given a problematic norm of asking detailed questions about our participants in the first place. And so perhaps ironically, by revising our demographic surveys to make them more accurate and inclusive, we are in some sense actually entrenching a problematic system of surveillance on clients. And this speaks to a larger question or debate within about social change, and that is about the hazards of reform when what is needed is revolution, right? Reforming our systems to make them less harmful paradoxically legitimizes and hence entrenches a system that is fundamentally harmful. And this doesn't mean that we shouldn't ever engage in reform activities. Clearly we're here because we do believe that revising our demographic surveys is important, but rather that we should always be aware of how limited reform is, and we should always be conscious that our reform activities shouldn't excessively compromise our ones towards revolution. Okay.
So, as Khadija mentioned, our toolkit, this work that we decided to collaborate around, it started with exploring the development of a demographic question, which on the surface may seem mundane or even benign. But as Khadija said, the ways that we ask about gender reflect and reproduce challenges and marginalizations that are present in society at large. And so this is why the toolkit itself attends to both the micro by providing the inclusive gender menu, as well as the macro. So we're situating the commonly used and problematic gender menu within a social context that creates oppressions on the basis of gender. So we want to start today with the macro question. What is the problem with gender? Most of us know what gender is. We can recognize its importance. We are guided by its so-called rules, but we don't have a readily available definition for it. And this is because gender is hegemonic. So it is a system that is so pervasive that we can conform to it without even knowing that we're doing so. In other words, the problem with gender is that it so thoroughly dictates our lives and our expectations about how others should and do and be, we rarely consciously and rigorously engage with it.
So the first step in unseating hegemony is naming it. So let's start with that. What is gender? Gender is an aspect of personal identity associated with social norms and expectations, and it has some features that we'll talk about. Gender is far-reaching. It informs how we identify, present ourselves. It informs how we relate to one another interpersonally, institutionally, and societally, and it informs how we spend our days and occupy space. Gender is also unstable. It is evolving, it's socially produced, socially sustained, and context-specific. Gender right here and right now looks differently than it did 100 years ago in another part of the world, for example. Gender is limiting. It is a set of rules and guidelines that nudge us in certain directions and erect barriers to others. Conversely, gender can also be liberating. It provides a framework for self-expression, such as through fashion. Gender is both something that we identify with, like saying, for example, I am a boy, and it's something that is imposed on us. We are assigned a gender at birth. People assume our gender based on visual cues, so what we look like, and people have expectations about what we do and should do based on their understanding of our gender. As such, it's important for us to interrogate commonly held assumptions about gender that create a discord between how we understand ourselves as gendered beings and how others relate to us on this basis.
Okay, so in order to interrogate these commonly held assumptions about gender, let's return to the micro context, and that is demographic questions about gender, which is something those of us working in the youth sector are very familiar with. And so a lot of you may recognize the example given here because it's one that we encounter commonly among gender menus. And here we see how the micro interacts with the macro, given the common unwritten and problematic assumptions about gender that are embedded in this menu. And so for the next portion of this presentation, let's unpack some of the assumptions about gender that we see reflected in this menu.
So the first assumption that we want to talk about is that gender equals sex. So the problem here is that male and female are often conflated with gender because of our convention for assigning gender to people based on visible anatomy at birth. Sex, however, is also not a binary. People exist between the two binary poles of male and female, and nonetheless, gender is a socially produced and sustained set of behaviors, performances, and roles that are actually unrelated to our biology. So conflating the two is not only inaccurate, but doing so undermines the personhood of those without a socially validated alignment between their gender and sex, like two-spirit, trans, intersex, and gender non-conforming people.
Second assumption that we want to unpack is you can either be a man or a woman. Gender is not an inevitable biological fact, and so there are an infinite number of options beyond the man and woman binary. And mainstream gender rules are maintained through our collective participation in them. So while there is nothing wrong with subscribing to them for ourselves, we must allow for others to circumvent those rules. And failing to include non-binary gender options serves to invalidate those who exist outside of or beyond the binary. And this really limits all of us in questioning, exploring, and expanding our relationships to sex and gender.
On many gender menus, trans is listed as a distinct and comprehensive gender identity. However, trans and other gender categories are not mutually exclusive. While words like man and woman refer to a person's gender identity, trans refers to a person's gender journey, or the process through which they've arrived at their gender identity. It is entirely possible and in fact common for a person to identify as trans as well as man, woman, or another gender. Trans youth are routinely subject to the denial of our genders, which is a form of violence that undermines our well-being and safety and contradicts a basic principle of respect, the expectation that we all have regardless of our gender identities to be referred to accurately and appropriately. So implying that trans cannot coexist with other gender options perpetuates this form of gender denial.
The fourth assumption that we wanted to address that we see reflected in that gender menu we showed, the fourth assumption that we want to address is the idea that to be cis is to be normal. For those who don't know, a cis person is considered to be the opposite of a trans person, and that cis is used to describe someone who identifies with the gender and or sex that was assigned to them at birth. The gender menu that we showed you perpetuates the idea that cis is normal because in there, as you'll recall, we see trans as a gender option, but we don't see cis. And that's because cis is a privileged status. And one way that privilege manifests is, and this is perhaps ironic, but one way that privilege manifests is through invisibility. And this invisibility shows up in all areas of life. So for example, the fact that I felt compelled to give a definition for cis, but I wouldn't for trans, is because most of us know what trans means, but fewer of us know what cis means. And this isn't because any one of us is individually ignorant, but because of systemic invisibilization. When something is designated as the norm or as the default, we often collectively fail to notice it. Another example of cis invisibility is the fact that trans people are expected to come out about their gender, while cis people never have to. And by failing to include cis in the gender menu, we're not only reflecting this common invisibilization of cisness, but we're reproducing cis as the invisible default status, and thus reaffirming that to be cis is to be normal, and to be trans or to be anything other than cis is different. The invisibilized and default status of cis harms two-spirit, trans, non-binary, and non-conforming people. But it also harms all of us, even those of us who do identify as cis. When we are constantly reinstating cis as the norm, we are continuing to make gender normativity the default. And in so doing, we're making it harder for all of us to express ourselves beyond the expectations of the normative sex and gender binary.
The last assumption that we're going to talk about today is that Western sex and gender frameworks are neutral and adequate. This assumption shows up as two-spirit not being included as a gender option. So Western frameworks of sex and gender are not universal. People across time and space have had a multitude of ways to conceptualize and engage with sex and gender. And a tactic and also effective colonialism and imperialism has been the imposition of Western ways of knowing and being onto subjugated populations. One of the foundational tasks of the Canadian settler colonial project was the disciplining of Indigenous gender and sexual practices, which did not conform to European standards of heterosexuality, cis-binary gender, and monogamy. Since 1990, the term two-spirit has been used by many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island to identify their genders and their sexual identities, as well as their roles within their communities. And the term was first introduced by Elder Myra Laramie. So it's important to note that being two-spirit is a fluid identity, and that individuals, communities, and nations may have their own understandings, teachings, and language. Failing to include two-spirit in the gender menu is an act of colonial erasure because it sustains the authority of Western sex and gender frameworks, while failing to acknowledge the sovereignty of Indigenous communities in defining their own personhood and relationality.
So when we discuss the problem with gender, we need to recognize two truths. All of us are harmed by a dominant approach to gender because it erects barriers to our self-actualization and our expression. And so it is in the interest of all of us to interrogate and challenge these approaches. And we must also recognize that some people are harmed by dominant gender systems more than others. And as allies, we need to center their experiences and defer to their analysis. So even while gender rules restrict all of us, those most immediately, explicitly, and severely harmed by gender rules are those who do not or cannot abide by them. This includes two-spirit, trans, gender nonconforming, and gender non-binary people.
So transphobia then can be defined as the collection of ideas and behaviors that incite and justify personal and structural violence against trans and other non-normatively gendered people. These ideas and behaviors uphold negative perceptions of transness, of gender non-normativity, and also of any deviation from gender rules. To further demonstrate this, here are some examples of how transphobia can manifest at different registers of society. So culturally, transphobia can manifest in things like gender reveal parties or the expectation to come out. Interpersonally, transphobia can look like misgendering, bullying, hate crimes, and eviction or disowning from family. Institutionally, what it can look like is binary gendered washrooms, gender quote unquote therapy, underemployment, the lack of appropriate service and care in healthcare, shelters, and also other social services. Legally and politically, for trans people, what this can look like is a lag in mandated protections, and things like lack of adequate funding for confirmation surgeries. Economically, trans people face poverty and housing discrimination. And representationally, trans people lack positions of visibility and authority. For example, Canada's first trans mayor was elected only several years ago. In regards to representation, another way that it can manifest is tragic or perverse depictions of trans people or transness in television, movies, and in media. Various studies show that trans and non-normative people experience worse psychological, physical, social, and economic well-being than their cisgender counterparts. But it's also important to remember that there's nothing wrong, pathological, or tragic about transness and non-normativity in itself. Worse outcomes are attributable entirely to transphobia.
Okay, transphobia and intersection. So in order to properly, holistically, accurately understand how transphobia operates and its effects, we have to adopt an intersectional analysis. Intersectionality is a method of analysis that asks us to consider a person's social categorization, so their race, their ability, their class, their gender, their sexual orientation. Intersectionality asks us to examine a person's social categorizations in concert with one another rather than separately. And this is because oppression and privilege within different categories interact uniquely and sometimes surprisingly to produce outcomes that are different and greater than the sum of their parts. And so we can't just simply add a person's marginalized identities to one another in order to calculate their sum total oppression. We need to look at the specificities of how all of these categorizations interact with one another. So as an example, let's look at the intersections of people who are marginalized by virtue of gender and class, i.e. the intersections of transphobia and classism. So firstly, trans people are more likely to live in poverty due to the effects of, as Saadia explained, internal, interpersonal, and structural transphobia, and specifically familial alienation that often renders trans and non-normative people homeless or without economic support, psychological distress that can make employment difficult, and discrimination in employment. So trans people are more likely to live in poverty. And then on the flip side, poverty exacerbates the effects of transphobic discrimination, because actualizing one's gender identity, like doing pretty much anything within a capitalist context, actualizing one's gender identity generally requires money. So for example, being able to buy new clothes or makeup, to afford chest binders, take time off work for gender confirmation surgery, etc. All of that requires some level of economic security. And so it's not enough for us to consider how a poor trans person is doubly burdened by both forms of oppression. We must consider how poverty is an effect of transphobia and how transphobia follows from poverty. Another quick example, trans women are statistically more victimized by hate crimes and violence than are trans men. And this is because of the way that transphobia and patriarchy intersect to produce particularly negative depictions of trans femininity and to particularly expose trans femmes and trans women to violence. And so these are just two examples, and of course, not even fully articulated, but the point here is that to understand transphobia in its depth and its breadth, we have to account for these nuances. And B, addressing transphobia requires that we are also invested in anti-poverty struggles, anti-racism, anti-ableism struggles, etc.
So to challenge transphobia, it requires a constant interrogation of the assumptions, the norms, and the behaviors that uphold our participation in enforcing gender rules. Because remember, we're unlearning gender rigidity. For example, asking someone's pronouns is not just an exercise, but also an expression of humility. It shows that, we recognize that we don't know how someone may identify and that our assumptions can be insufficient and even misguiding. We can't begin and end at asking pronouns or even changing our gender menus, but what we can do is incorporate these micro examples into a broader understanding of how to engage with humility and with respect.
So we know that changing our gender menus is insufficient to unseat transphobia and gender normativity. And we also know, as we talked about earlier, that changing our gender menus still legitimizes a system in which we collect information about those we serve. However, we created an inclusive gender menu to address the assumptions about gender that we unpacked earlier. And this is one small step towards making our services safer, more relevant, and more responsive to those who access them, and provides the basis for a larger conversation about gender inclusiveness in our work and also beyond. And you'll see here on the slide the question asking about gender, and this is included on a fact sheet that we co-created that also has a glossary with definitions of terms that you can refer to when you're designing a similar question for your youth program.
Okay, so of course, we don't expect you to adopt this menu wholesale without an explanation for why we believe that it addresses the problematic assumptions about gender that we just described. So to sort of run through how this gender menu differs positively from that which we presented earlier. So firstly, it corrects for the for the conflation between sex and gender by replacing the terms male and female with boy/man and girl/woman. It also acknowledges gender beyond the binary. We have the options of non-conforming and non-binary on there. By asking people who are filling it out to select all that apply, and I see someone in the chat has remarked on positively about this feature. By asking people to select all that apply, we are recognizing that most gender categories are not mutually exclusive. And as Saadia had explained earlier, cis and trans are aspects of a person's gender journey, while girl and non-binary are aspects of a person's gender identity. And therefore, it's entirely reasonable, common, appropriate, and logical that someone should be able to speak to both their gender journey and their gender identity as different things within a single demographic question. It also makes visible cisness by including cis as an option, and therefore working to make cis no longer the default and or the norm against which all other gender journeys are then measured as being different. Right, okay, thanks. By including two-spirit as an option, the menu is trying to unseat the supremacy of Western sex and gender frameworks, and further recognizes that in particular, in the context of colonialism, people who are indigenous to Turtle Island have exceptional or particular authority to define themselves beyond and outside the Western norms for doing so. But of course, as we're talking throughout this this webinar about revolution versus reform, and about how even our progress is contextualized within our limitations, including two-spirit is still inadequate towards decolonization, and in fact is reflective of the colonial context, because the term two-spirit only exists in response to colonialism. And historically, and even today, nations across Turtle Island have had unique ways of understanding sex and gender and of relating to one another on that basis. They didn't necessarily use this an umbrella term. Nonetheless, we still think it's important to include because it is a chosen term by Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and it is a limited way, at least, of alluding to the non-universality of Western ways of knowing, being, and relating. And then we also provide the option to write in, and that is in order to recognize gender's infinite possibilities, as well as to integrate humility into our gender menu, because we recognize that no matter how exhaustive, accurate, or appropriate we attempt to be, and for example, Facebook offers 50 different gender options, but no matter how exhaustive we attempt to be, there will always remain the possibility of omission and inaccuracy, because of A, our own limitations, and B, because of the nature of gender as infinite and constantly evolving. And then this isn't depicted here, like on the slide, the menu, but we also include in the toolkit a definition for each of the terms, and we do encourage people to include on their demographic surveys the definition of these terms. And this helps to make the gender menu a site for education, but it also helps to reflect the contextuality of the menu. In this time and place, we think that this menu is sufficient in terms of most accurately and inclusively accounting for the spectrum of gender options. But in another time and place, this would not be the case, because gender norms and sensibilities are constantly shifting and manifesting differently depending upon where we are. And so by providing definitions, we're trying to allude to or situate this gender menu within the context that produced it, and hopefully resist the temptation to universalize it or to assume that it should be the last word on gender.
So we have come to the point in today's webinar where we are going to again invite you to ask questions. We wanted to make sure that we set aside enough time to address questions that may come up. We encourage you to do so in the chat box. And we actually have another guest joining us for this portion of the webinar. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to invite Burka from LGBT YouthLine to join us.
Sorry, Katie, actually, Burka let me know that their Wi-Fi kicked them out of the.
No, I think that all worked out.
Oh,
I think Burka's able
okay,
to join
so here
us.
I am 10 steps behind.
No worries.
Okay, I'm zipping it.
And I know,
thanks, folks, for having me. My internet is still looking choppy, so hopefully I'll be okay for this portion.
I know that's something that has come up, at YouthREX, and I know a few folks have kind of have asked this question about, well, how do we use this redesigned demographic question for the purposes of reporting? And we know that a lot of the reasons why youth programs, or the ways in which youth programs ask about gender, is sometimes dictated by funders. And I'm wondering, maybe Khadija, if you want to begin, just, how do we report on gender identity in relation to our total number of program participants when one young person may select more than one gender identity? So how do we think about incorporating this demographic question so that we are responsive and that we are capturing this information accurately and inclusively and without perpetuating harm, but then report to our funders on who is engaging in our programs, as we are often asked to do?
Right. Thank you, Katie. And you know, this has already come up with some of the programs that we're working with as we've been piloting this gender menu with them, and that question constantly arises. And I think asking this question reflects sort of the context that we exist in and our tendency to conflate gendered personhood with personhood, right? And so in general, the reason why we feel so comfortable with having only one option for gender is because when we're reporting on numbers or when we're describing people, we tend to use gender as a stand-in for human, right? So we say we serve 30 girls and 20 boys instead of saying we serve 51 humans. And so the fact that with this gender menu, we no longer have that option of a 1-to-1 ratio. We can no longer rely on the number of participants matching the number of gender identities that are listed. We have to move away from this model, right? And so we recommend in reporting, making sure to give the total number of participants and then explain how these different participants identify, right? And the knowing that the numbers wouldn't match. And our suggestions for menus on race and ethnicity and on sexual orientation would have a similar result. But I think the reason why it's so difficult for us to grapple with this idea is because, like I said, we're really used to conflating gendered personhood with personhood. And I think it's actually really important for us to no longer be able to do that, to talk about our participants in terms of gendered numbers. Because part of the reason why it's so difficult to be gender non-normative is because our entire society is so thoroughly organized around gender, right? We talk about people at the basic level in terms of their gendered self. The washroom you go to, the way that you're described, your name, everything comes down to our gender. And so moving away from gender centricism, I think, is actually a really positive thing. And so there's actually a benefit to not being able, I think, to have a 1-to-1 reporting ratio on gender. Katie, I think we had an interesting question in the chat about, and I saw some people seconded the question, which is about, I'm wondering about the inclusion, this is from Ella, I'm wondering about the inclusion of intersex. Is this not continuing to conflate sex and gender? I'm also wondering if the order in which these options appear in, was that something consciously decided upon when deciding the menu? So just to answer the second part of that question, we just put everything in alphabetical order in order to limit any sort of implicit hierarchization between different genders. But I don't know if because some people seconded that question, I'm wondering if Saadia or Katie, or if you want to answer the part about the intersex. Okay, well, I can take a go at it, which is to say that absolutely, and that's I think that's a really excellent point, that intersex comes out of is an option within sex and not specifically within gender. But then it becomes complicated because a lot of people do self-identify as intersex, and the fact of their intersexness is central to their gender identity, particularly because it is a non-normative experience. And so, yes, I think both of those two things are true. That using the term intersex is sort of reproducing or bringing back in the sex gender conflation, and B, intersex in functionally is gender identity because people use it that way.
Something else that came up, which I know, we've had conversations about as well, is, why do we ask this question? We talked at the outset about sort of, affirming these systems that ask us to ask questions about our participants, but why are we asking questions about gender? Why is that important? Is that important to our funders? And why are our funders asking those questions? Is it important to how we think about designing more inclusive programming to be more responsive? So I didn't know if anyone had anything that they wanted to speak to on that topic. I think it's an important point, and one that we've often talked about is, if we're going to ask about gender, how can we do it in an inclusive and accurate way, but thinking more critically about why we're asking the question to begin with, and what does it actually add to our programming, whether that's an intake form or a demographic question on a survey.
Yeah, if I can chime in, I'm still kind of forming my thoughts, but I do want to get these out before I lose my thoughts. So I think it was a question in the chat that asked, how useful is it to ask about gender in the first place? And that's something that I'm also thinking about. So reflecting on this question, I think some useful things to ask yourself if you are perhaps a programming, you work in like youth programming and things like that. So when conceptualizing programs, thinking about, is this data even necessary at the outset? If not, then you've probably just saved yourself a ton of time. And you can ask, other relevant questions like age and things like that. But I think, if it is necessary, what are the ways in which we can ask about gender in ways that are inclusive? So which is the reason, we brought about this inclusive gender menu. So I think at the beginning of any sort of like programming or thinking about data collection, thinking about gender and asking about gender in terms of like, do we even need to ask about gender is also a critical step. And something that I'm thinking more about that I wonder if either of you have thoughts around are, the funder requirements and limitations and asks from funders. So if your program is being funded by someone, an entity that is asking for that data on gender, what are some ways that we can navigate that youth workers can navigate those kinds of things when it comes from funders and when it's not necessarily something that we can control?
Khadija, is it okay if I chime in and stay off video?
Yes, please.
Are you able to hear me clearly enough? We're going to see if this works.
Yes.
I've never had this problem before, so sorry, folks. And so everything that Saadia said around program delivery totally makes sense. I think it's like gender is often just put in as a default, and is it needed in lots of programming is a critical question to ask. There's two pieces around this content. One is when you're asking the question in non-inclusive ways, it's harmful. So that's the one reason often that I find myself talking about this question a lot, and so glad that this work has happened. The second piece of it is when it comes to funders, we actually only, whatever we collect around data is who matters in our country. Unfortunately, this is the truth of how funding works, how policy work works, and how movement of programming works. And so if we don't collect data around trans people's experiences, it means that their experiences aren't being included in what's actually happening. And so when it comes to data collection, this is why it's really important to start segregating this data and being able to see if you run a women's program, is the experience of trans feminine people in your program different than that of cis women? It very likely is. And so as we think about data collection, some of it is like, it's about inclusion and safety, and some of it is also about how do we actually get differentials in data? And I saw a question earlier also about, can we just ask trans? If that's the first step you can take and do that in a safe way, that's great. That's a great first step. And also we know that the experiences of trans people across the spectrum vary. And again, knowing that data, like was being talked about earlier around intersectionality, matters. And so it's like the more work we can do to bring this data together and actually understand what are the distinct experiences of folks, who's not even represented in our programs. Are trans feminine folks feeling comfortable coming to programs? Are trans masculine, male identified trans people coming to programs that are just called women in trans? Until we know more of that data, we won't know where there's gaps. So I'll stop there. I'm also noticing that there was a lot of questions around categorization and reporting. I think, Khadija, you talked about this when I got cut off, right?
Yeah, Burka, we did, but then I think there was some additional questions about, was it like grouping together different answers? I think someone asked that.
Yeah, I think there was quite a few questions, and I see a registering question also when it comes to reporting how to combine categories. And none of these data or gender menus are perfect, right? Like this is still an evolving process. I would say like it's possible to combine categories and think about what is going to make sense and then how you're actually going to talk about what you've combined. The clarity is what's important. At YouthLine, when we do data like external data, because we know what our number percentages are, we actually just report on trans people as like binary trans folks and non-binary folks as two separate data points. And we combine them when we put it out externally. Because when it comes to putting out like a annual report, I can put those data points together, but I think, Khadija, you were talking when it's just statistically an insignificant number, what does it mean to report? And also there's anonymity issues sometimes if it's just one or two people, depending on how large your numbers are. So I think a starting point of that also would be is when you think of the gender menu that's been given in this report, that entire menu in that detail might not be applicable to your program. You might actually want to combine it from the beginning in categorizations that make sense. Yeah.
But Burka, so sorry, Burka, when you said that you report on trans binary people and non-binary people as two separate categories, so what are you combining there? Like what group, what categories are you combining?
So anyone who identifies as a trans man or trans woman, we combine.
Oh, I see.
Because the data is not statistically significant enough. And we keep non-binary separate, and that includes all of the umbrella terms of non-binary as a single terminology, because we believe that it's important to report the number of youth who are identifying outside of the binary.
Someone was asking about whether we have a similar toolkit for asking about sexual orientation, which we do not yet have, but I think this collaboration with YouthLine was such an important experience for YouthREX, and also I think the resources that we developed pointed us towards thinking about other demographic questions and how we might support youth programs in thinking critically about assumptions that may be inherent in those, and providing resources, tools, and supports around a question about sexual orientation as an example, or questions about other identity categories that programs may need or may be asked to include. I think there's sort of, as we talked about before, there's the practical application that we hope that that folks who are learning and unlearning with us today can apply in their work. And then there is also sort of this advocacy component to this work. And we really recognize the importance of not only sharing this with this audience. I know a lot of folks work across the youth sector in a variety of different roles, but folks who are working directly or in partnership with youth. And we know that we also need to share this information with funders as well, so that we can better align the conversations that we're having around what we're asking and how we're asking. So this is sort of the first, I think, resource on this topic that we've engaged in creating. And I think we're going to continue this work in different ways and to continue to recognize both the practical applications in supporting youth programs, but also thinking about the advocacy work that we need to do together to sort of change or shift or reimagine the conversations that we're having.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. If I can just add for the question around sex, it's like, it goes back to what Saadia was saying, is like really critically asking what you need for. And I think I saw some people talk that it's from a clinical context. And even with clinical context, like there are organizations like Planned Parenthood Toronto and Action Canada for Sexual Health doing some really great advocacy around this work of asking, like, when do you actually need to know people's like sexual characteristics? What is important? Because there's an assumption that in medical fields that's required and needed when it's not actually true in lots of cases. So definitely maybe a resource in the future, but at least at an entry level, it's again critically asking that question of when it's needed.
And sorry, sort of along those lines of actually interrogating what we need to know and why, right? Because like you're saying, Burke and Saadia, so much we take for granted in the medical field, for example, that we need to know person's biological sex in order to serve them, when that's really not the case. So I just want to draw attention to a question that came in from Aziza, who also happens to be my sister, but she's in a different location than me. So this is entirely staged. But she was saying, is there a way in these questionnaires to center the system of oppression instead of or alongside the personal identity, which I think is an excellent point, which brings us back to what do we actually want to know? If the purpose of our demographic surveys is to assess who among our participants is impacted by particular oppressive forces in order to ensure that we're adequately serving them, or that the normative standards that arise from those systems of oppression are being accounted for, then maybe that is something that we should ask. And we actually never do that. I don't think that's a norm in program evaluation at all, but maybe that's also something to consider, to move away from identity, which sort of is a stand-in for the relevant system of oppression, and to actually more to more specifically ask about the system. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts about that.
I think that these gender menus and the one that we've presented today are at the very kind of base level suggestions and perhaps guidelines for you to adopt in whatever ways that you see fit for your programs. And then there's also, I feel, other ways that you can name, things like systems of oppression, whether that is through some context building before the gender menu on the form itself, or in conversation with program participants. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
I see we have a question about sports, which I think is like a really fraught and challenging topic. Is from Angel about youth sports, and where it is customary, I think, in almost or like historically, and at almost every level, like at the level of the Olympics to the NBA or the NHL, to segregate people according to gender. But what we've learned from, I think, as that quite famous incident of a trans feminine athlete who won in swimming in the women's category, what we realize is that what we were distinguishing by wasn't really gender, but cisgenderness, right? And so then that became a topic of debate and contention that I think was mostly rooted in transphobia. But it's definitely an interesting question to explore. So I don't know if anyone had thoughts or wisdom or insight to share about that. Well, just one point that I'll make, and this is more of another question rather than an answer, which is that, when we encounter trans athletes, they force us to confront exactly how frail our system of gender and sex is, because the boundaries between male and female are not are extremely poorly defined and inconsistent and incoherent, right? There's no like biological test to determine a person's sex, and we don't apply it ever. We don't even think about applying it, except in situations where we think that someone is violating it, and that in transness. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just another question that I think probably points to the death of gendered sports, maybe, or maybe something else. But I mean, yeah, so that's not really an answer, but I think that's just another question, or just another aspect to ponder.
Yeah, a thought that I'm having around youth and sports is I'm wondering if there are other ways to have separate teams, or kind of break up those categories in different ways. So maybe we're not segregating by gender anymore, but maybe it's more of an age category where youth of all genders can play the sport with other youth their age. That's just one option. I don't have a ton of experience with youth sports. I don't play sports, have never played sports. But yeah, I'm wondering, like, for folks who are in youth sports, if there are other ways that, you know, those teams can be made and created that don't necessarily include gender in the ways that they historically have in the field of gendered sports.
That's I think that's a really good point. And I think it also brings to the fore how we just take for granted that the reasonable logical distinction is between men's sports and women's sports. And we're worried about an unfair advantage of someone who we think belongs in a men's sport who is in a women's sport. But the most the most dominant unfair advantage is actually class, like in every possible sport, right? And then you brought up the fact of age, right, which is also necessarily a factor. So maybe there's other ways we could organize sports. I just see that Sarah's asked how might we consider approaching this gender menu when we're working with children under the age of, let's say, 6 years old. And I think that's a really good question, because I think it sort of brings us back to the idea of learning versus unlearning. And a lot of homophobic and transphobic discourse kind of orients around this idea that young people or children are not ready or capable of understanding the extent of gender diversity or sexual diversity, which is based on the assumption that normative gender, normative sexuality is the basic reality, and anything that we learn differently than that is different, right? But what we're actually trying to suggest is that we are socialized into gender normativity. And so, in fact, if anything, the best audience for normalizing these questions of, or normalizing the assumption of diverse gender, is actually younger people who haven't been quite as socialized, right? And so, I mean, that's sort of the philosophical answer, but Sarah, I think becomes one forum in addition to others for discussing gender and sexuality in its diversity, with young people, recognizing that if a young person is young enough to know the difference between the gender difference between mom and dad or sister and brother, then there's no reason why they shouldn't also be at an age in order to understand more gender differences. But the problem is that we've trained them out of that ability to understand.
And I think a few folks have pointed this out in the chat, this idea that gender identity is not fixed, and that, you know, folks may be identifying in different ways at different times in their lives. And so this menu is meant to be expansive. And also, you know, we have the option for a young person to write in an identity that is not included in the menu that aligns with how they themselves identify. So just, again, creating space and creating that expansiveness, and recognizing that a young person may choose multiple identities, may choose to write in their own understanding of their own identity in that moment, and that may change over time, and just creating space for that expansiveness and how we think about engaging with our program participants, engaging with them for a workshop or a long-term program, or engaging with them year over year.
If I can just add to that, and I think it'll also follow up in this question around limited options for young folks. This might have also come up in the earlier question when Khadija, that's when I got cut off, you were talking about, can we talk about the isms as opposed to the identities? And I think all of this comes down to also recognizing that these are systems that we sit in, and for many of us, this is our livelihoods. And I can spend every day and night thinking about the different ways to ask a gender menu, or the different ways to think about gender. And there also is an access component and accessibility of language and understanding that's age appropriate. And that's also as appropriate for anyone to be able to access. So the less options can sometimes be helpful, but again, if this is about data collection, it's like the format of that data collection will really change what's happening. If you're self-reporting it after you've had conversations, that'll look very different than a survey, than something that's done at the beginning, like a trans person will, depending on a space and their interaction with it, a person may disclose identities or not when it's given to them right off the bat versus if they've already built trust with you later. Like all of these things are part of data collection methodology and change impact. And there's no perfect way. And so especially for kids under 6, it's like, if this is about data still, what's the point of data? Are you looking, because the language at that point becomes gender independent kids, and there isn't actually funding or policy or resources and a lot happening around the difference between gender identities for kids under 10 or 12. Like it's still such an emerging space. There's so much pushback from different systems to even allow this language to come into spaces. So what is your role in supporting the pushing of youth being able to, and children being able to be gender independent? And how much is actually important? Because it might not be important at 5 for them to know whether they think they're going to be a girl or if they're non-binary or whatever. But what might be more important is, are they being able to express a gender outside of the one that they've been put into or they've been assigned? So just thinking about those things too is like, it would be obviously better data to be able to say my experiences of trans misogyny versus just transphobia versus whatever. But for an average participant, they might not understand what that means. So data collection also has to find that balance of experience with what can actually be feasible. Another example of this is like, at one point we were just writing cis men or whatever that looked like. And yes, more and more recognition is happening, but a lot of people still don't know what cis means. So if you're going to be in programs where that might be possible, then that also has to show up in your questions to make sure people know that it applies to them. Was this question answered about a checkbox versus an open-ended item? Karen, put it in again.
I don't think so.
Is my internet's
Burka,
cooperating?
yeah.
I can try to answer
Burka,
it quickly.
Yeah.
I think it's really just about what you need it for, Karen, or anyone else who might have that question. Like there was also a lot of questions about how to then evaluate data. Like open-ended questions create a qualitative response format, which then you have to do a lot of coding and work for. So if it's a small sample set and you could do that, absolutely, an open-ended gender question is great.
And maybe it even having an open-ended
can sometimes help.
Oh, sorry, Burka.
I'm done.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, like sometimes even having a purely open-ended question then dictates the checkbox answers you have the next time, right? Because you're gathering a sense of the categories that are relevant to people that you're serving. And Katie, so Sarah has wrote in here, are there opportunities to connect with any of you if we have follow-up questions? My answer would be you're on your own, Sarah, too bad, but I don't think that's the actual official company line.
Yes, of course. We have the final slide in our slide deck has contact information for the teams that were part of putting together these resources and also this conversation. And so absolutely, I mean, at YouthREX, we can answer your questions in collaboration around how you're designing intake forms, how you're designing evaluation surveys, how you're thinking about using evidence to inform your program design or development. So, you know, absolutely, that's a space where we can definitely collaborate and continue sort of fleshing out some of the questions. There's a lot of questions, some are more specific than others that are coming up today, but that's absolutely a space where we can continue these conversations. And we also at YouthREX have an online community of practice that we call Rex Virtual Cafe. And so we've created a space there to start to, we hope, invite folks to kind of unpack some of the challenges that they may be facing around demographic questions and thinking about how do we center equity, how do we center, you know, being inclusive and respectful and capturing accurate information. So we'll share those links as well. And that's a space where you can connect with members of our team, but also colleagues and other folks across the sector. And hopefully together we can kind of unpack the challenges and collectively come up with strategies and opportunities again to advocate for more expansive understandings of the identity categories that we include in our questions to our youth participants.
If it's okay, can I conclude with some thoughts that I'm having? You know, we're all working kind of like within this frontline youth work context, in a larger context of a transphobic society, and then putting those two things together on like with funders and funding requirements on top of that, it can create, I think, an environment where the focus can be on, okay, so how do we ask about these things and how do we get the data that we need? And maybe instead of that focus, you know, there are other ways that we can kind of navigate this context that we're all in as youth workers, grappling with transphobia and all of those things. So if there's one thing that folks take away, other than the amazing gender menu that we've created here, and we've you know, thoughts around how to ask about gender, if there's some things that you take away, what I hope is that folks will take away thinking about the practice of data collection itself. And I can tell you that as a trans youth, in my experience, that my relationships with service providers are often more impactful and meaningful to me than maybe just being asked about gender on a survey without that prior relationship, or without efforts to create a meaningful relationship. Because it's very different to be asked about gender when you don't necessarily know where that data is going and why it's being collected. So that transparency is very important for trans youth, especially I can you know, share that with my experience. That's important to me. And above all, relationships with service providers are really impactful also in navigating this kind of ecosystem. Yeah, so while our gender menus won't, you know, fix transphobia, they are in conjunction with relationships with service providers, they can help to disrupt and challenge transphobia. And so those are kind of my concluding thoughts. Thanks everyone for listening to me. I'm going to turn it back to Khadija and Katie.
Thank you so much, Saadia. Khadija, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share as we come to the end of our time together?
No, I mean, I did want to apologize for all those questions that got lost or that we missed. But if anyone maybe has, is that okay, Katie? If anyone has like
Sure.
one final burning question, maybe we can take that since we have a couple minutes. Okay, we've answered all of the possible questions. Oh, except for Burka's.
Well,
How about this one? How should we respond to
Yes.
push back about the gender identity field? And Burka, so you mean with funders? Like what is how to approach that conversation with funders? And I feel like this is one of those Burka questions where Burka asks a question and then also has the answer.
No, this is straight out of the registration sections. I didn't make up this question.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, Burka, did you want to answer it?
They're talking about people actually filling it out.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, that's a tough one. Burka, do you have experience with that?
Yeah, my internet is still in and out. I was not asking it thinking I would answer it, for what it's worth. I would just say there was a similar question around how do we approach this with racialized and or immigrant youth, which ties in the same theme. And so what I would just say is that often there's a lot of fear of pushback that's not actually real. And also a lot of assumption of where that transphobia will come from, which actually is rare in immigrant youth, because most immigrant youth and immigrants are just excited to have service access, to be honest. And so there's often assumptions of which communities will push that transphobia at a systemic and individual and school system level is primarily coming from spaces that are not immigrant or racialized, is what I.
Thank you for saying that.
So of what you want to do, and knowing that, like, as a service provider, you create the climate and the environment of safety. And for people, they might be like, hey, what does this mean? So making sure that every level at these forums, because oftentimes what happens is that these data forms are created by some other department, and office administrators in clinics or places are expected to put them out and whatnot, and they have idea how to support them. So just making sure that people might be like, what does this mean?
Berkey, you were cutting out a bit there, but I
Um,
think we got the gist.
Yeah. And I would just say that as service providers, our job is to set the standards of safety and inclusion. And that includes sometimes having pushback.
Right.
Who's
We've
closing
talked
this
a
one?
lot.
That's it from me.
We
Sorry.
talked a lot about how leaving space for silence in a Zoom meeting or in a Zoom webinar can feel a little awkward sometimes. And we wanted to make sure to intentionally do that, to leave space for questions and for whatever may come up. We
Because we love to make you feel awkward. That's what we do.
It's important to sit in the discomfort, I think. But we're all really grateful that you shared time with us today. We had sort of an unprecedented level of interest in this particular session. And so we know that these conversations are critical, of course, but also that, thinking about how we do this work more inclusively, intentionally, accurately is really important to folks who are working with young people. And so thank you for all that you do. And thank you so much to Saadia and Burka and Haley from LGBT YouthLine for partnering with YouthREX in both developing these important resources, but also creating space for this conversation, which we actually really believe will be the first of many conversations. And we encourage you all to keep in touch and stay connected. I think we've shared a feedback form. If you have feedback on today's conversation, today's event, we'd love to hear from you. Please keep in touch with us and let us know how we can support your work in a variety of different ways. Learn more about the work of LGBT YouthLine if you don't already, as a resource and support. We're really, really proud and grateful to have been able to collaborate with them, and look forward to future collaborations. And we hope that you all stay well and have a really good rest of your day. Thank you for being with us.
Ditto, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.